On this episode of Random Paint Jobs.
Kaja! Kaja! Kaja!
Greetings all, Morgan with High Tide Games in beautiful Powell River, British Columbia, Canada. Today, we'll be giving this Birdman fellow a complete repaint in preparation for an evening with his ladybird friend. As you can see, Birdman is a little grungy, completely unsuited for a night of fine aerial dining. He's a pre-painted model, similar to WizKids or HeroClix lines, though I'm not certain as to his exact pedigree. I did a quick Google image search for plastic Birdman miniature, but wasn't able to find this particular sculpt. If you happen to know who he is, let me know in the comments below. The reason why I chose to paint him was because of his absolutely gorgeous feathers. Lots of fine detail that should dry brush nicely. Regarding his color scheme, I figure that as imitation is said to be the sincerest form of flattery, he should dress to match his date. And who, pray tell, is his date? Well, it's none other than Maiden. That's right, folks, we're injecting a bit of magic into their night of potential romance. Kaja Foglio has one of the most recognizable art styles of Magic's early years. It can be a little bit goofy at times, but I find that goofiness fits well with the general feel of early Magic artwork. Before we jump into discussing colors and throwing paint on plastic, we have a bit of cleaning to do, namely removing the cardboard base, any crusted superglue at the feet, and spraying down a new layer of primer. Alright, Birdman's all scrubbed. In addition to the standard black primer with zenithal highlight, I pinned his feet for a special base that I have planned. We can now turn to color schemes. If we look at Birdmaiden's skin, the dominant colors are grays with a touch of brown. Highlights look like they're done mostly with added white, maybe a bit of blue. The texture is also quite flat, which might be hard to translate to a sculpted model. The light blue of her poofy pants matches the sky she's soaring in. The deepest folds are an almost purple. A green scarf or sash is tied well below her hips, yet still manages to keep her pants in place. Her top is predominantly orange and is fringed in white pearls or beads that have a bit of blue in them. Her hair is raven black. When we look at her wings, there are three distinct feather layers. A deep purple-blue layer that matches the folds of her pants, a green layer, and a fiery orange layer with black tips. Her tail feathers appear to match those of her wings, though the blue is obscured by her pants. Matching skin tones should be fairly easy. Birdman is pretty ripply in comparison though. Instead of pants, Birdman wears a loincloth of impractical length, and holding it in place is a chain instead of another piece of fabric. Since green chains would be forced, we'll nix the green and go with a metallic color. While Birdman isn't wearing a shirt, he does have a pair of armlets or bracers. We'll paint those orange too as a nod to Birdmaiden's shirt. Black head feathers are fairly straightforward. As fortune would have it, Birdman's wings are a perfect match. 3 distinct layers of fanning feathers. We should be able to translate this fairly well. The only real discrepancy between the two birdfolk are the accessories. Birdmaiden has pearled fringes and Birdman has a chain and pendant, as well as these little armbands. I'm thinking gold chains and silver pendant, as Birdman likes his bling. It's now time to paint some plastic. Most of the paints and washes I'm using are Army Painter products from the Nulzur's Marvelous Pigments Monster paint set, released by Wizards of the Coast for their D&D miniature line. This was the first batch of paints I picked up after returning to the hobby. I'll be referring to the colors by the Army Painter names, not those used in the set itself, which are different and named to sort of match the kind of products that you're painting. White and black paints are from Vallejo, as is the dark Prussian. We begin with skin tones. I started with fur brown, but after putting down the first coat and comparing the tones with Kaja's original painting, I found it to be too rosy and actually flesh-like. So I repainted the skin in a combination of dirt spatter and castle gray. There was some compromising on the color matching. There's more brown in my model than gray, more warmth and coolness, but that's fine. This is my model and I can do what I want with it. With the skin dried, I turned to the loincloth. Dark Prussian is a beautiful shade of blue. I used it for the Capital Killers Orc Blood Bowl team that I painted for High Tide, and the transition to brighter colors is lovely. Because of how bright Birdman's environment is, I decided to use pure Prussian as the base and work up from there. After the first coat, I moved over to the blue feathers. I already had the color on my brush and palette, so I figured I might as well finish everything I could then and there. Next, I jump back to apply another coat to the skin while I let all the blue dry to eliminate any show through from the original skin tone. This is one of the main reasons you apply paints in thin layers. If you're not happy with your initial try, you can repaint without obliterating details. After the skin, it's back to blue. Then on to angel green for the second feather layer. For the final fiery layer, I used a combination of dragon red and lava orange. Took a few tries to get a base color I was happy with that was neither too red nor too orange. The Birdman card isn't in frame, but I'm constantly referring to it to try and match colors as best as I can. The wings proved more troublesome than I had anticipated. They just ate paint. All the little ridges significantly increased the model's surface area, as well as providing little capillary grooves that held on to paint, and I had to mix multiple batches of orange on palette. It sucked up so much paint that I had to let the model sit overnight to allow it to dry between coats. It wasn't that the paint was thick, it just took forever for all the water to evaporate from between the ridges. A quick few layers of the same orange, and the brazier base coats were done. Next, dry brushing. Santa wife was kind enough to bring me a bag of makeup brushes for Christmas, and I was excited to try them out. Straight lava orange for the first round. I'm only trying to hit the middle sections of the orange feathers since the tips are going to be black, and I want to keep shadows at the base. It's at this point that I realized I hadn't considered the issue of overbrush. In retrospect, I could have painted and brushed the blue layer in full, then the green layer in full, then the orange layer in full, to prevent accidentally hitting feathers with the wrong color. That said, it would mean committing myself fully to each set of highlights without having all the base colors for context. If I wasn't happy with colors I had chosen, I'd have to rebrush everything anyways. For this particular model with all its splayed feathers, I think the process I chose was the correct one. However, I'll need to be more cognizant of the overbrush issue for the next project involving a lot of dry brushing. Next comes Phoenix Flames for our yellow highlights. Very light on paint here. I'll come back at the end to manually pick out some ridges and brighten everything up. I wanted a bit more contrast between the orange and green layers, so I added a pseudo wash of heavily watered down dragon red with a bit of black to create a burnt maroon. Not only would this provide more depth, but the darkened areas happened to underlay where the brightest highlights of the feathers above would be, which was nice. A little bit of touch up. I believe this technique is called feathering. The process for green feathers was the same. I did the smart thing and started with a wash, angel green, a bit of black, and lots of water. Dry brushing began with green skin and continued with the addition of increasing amounts of Phoenix yellow. Remember, if you want bright greens, add yellow. If you want pale greens, add white. More dark washes, this time in blue for the loincloths, the deepest recesses and feathers. Highlights were started with crystal blue and finished with sky blue. I'd come back later to hit the tips with void shield blue. The last wing components to paint were the black tips. I really didn't want to screw this up, which thankfully I didn't. Highlights were done in simple grays. Leaning back and reviewing what I had done, I was pretty satisfied with the almost finished results. With the wings more or less complete, I finished off the loincloth with the same blues as the feathers. Nothing fancy, no micro textures or anything like that, just following along the folds for a silky, flowing effect. Again, referring to source material to make sure everything is kosher. A base of black for the head, then onto skin highlights. Given the bleach quality of Birdman's skin, I opted to just add white to the base colors I used. The rippliness of the sculpt made highlights straightforward to apply. Comparing my paint job with Kaja's, I decided more depth of color was needed and applied a small amount of flush wash. It isn't keeping with the original style, but that's okay. Again, this is my model. I can do what I want. One last round of skin highlights. Simple gray highlights for the head, making sure it reads as black and not gray. Birdman's feet are bird feet, not people feet. I seem to recall that a bird's feet tended to be darker than its legs, so I mixed up a combination of dirt spatter and black. I certainly wasn't going to try and copy Birdman's gross corpse feet. While the feet dried, I picked out the eyes in green skin. I know eyes are a hang-up for some people, but I honestly don't mind doing them. It just takes a steady hand and some patience. Dirt spatter for all the gold chain base, in addition to foot highlights with added white. Dirt spatter again for the talons. followed by light striations of goblin skin, which is unique to the paint set I'm using. Add to this a touch of white for highlights. The same process was used for the beak. I've realized that I like painting bone and suspect I'll enjoy painting scales. This is probably a good thing, as one of the random paint jobs I have planned for the future has a lot of scales in it. Turning to the chains, I went with weapon bronze for the first metallic layer, followed by a hit of dark tone wash. Final highlights were done in bright gold. A base coat of black for the pendant, then shining silver, then dark tone, and a final touch of shining silver. The last thing to paint were the bracers. I used the same color suite as the orange feathers and painted the two jewels as giant pearls to match Birdman. Gorgon hide for a cool blue base with added white for highlights. And that's it. Other than a bit of off-camera cleanup, Birdman is done. The final step is the base. I decided early on that I wanted Birdman to be standing at the edge of a sandstone outcropping, as if he were showing off his elegant plumage to bird maidens circling before him. To that end, I cut up a chunk of bark, sealed it with watered down white glue, and painted it to match the desert sand of Kaja's background. It took me a bit of time to figure out how to get something reasonably close to Kaja's art without digging into more paints that I have. The result isn't perfect, the color's a bit off, and I dry brushed on too much white, but it's close enough, and I'm happy with the result. I don't remember the exact colors I used, mostly just a mix of what I already had on my palette from previously painting the model, plus a bit of Vallejo leather brown. Basically, I just fooled around until I had something that worked. After painting and gluing down the base, I pinned our man of birds to it. I would have preferred a slightly larger base to limit the risk of tipping, given how high his center of gravity feels, but unfortunately my current base supply is fairly basic. And there we have it. And here he is, looking all fine and dapper. Let's get a close-up of his before and after. From gross to gorgeous. Now how about a side-by-side of Birdman and Bird Maiden? What a lovely looking couple. No? Overall, I'm fairly satisfied with the final result. Were I to repaint this sculpt, I'd up the contrast another notch or two to try and brighten all the colors. Maybe spend a bit more time highlighting the feathers by hand. They still read as sort of flat to my eye. They just don't have that pop or that depth that I was hoping for. Otherwise, yeah, model's good. Gonna sit on the shelf at high tide and or in my cabinet. Don't know yet. Well, see what happens to it. Okay, well that's it. Thank you for watching this video, and a big thank you to my wonderfully talented wife, Kelsey, who has taken it upon herself to learn how to edit videos. If you've enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. I think that's what you're supposed to do. If you didn't like the video, like and subscribe. The aim is to put out a new video once a month, mostly miniature painting. We might change that as time goes on. We might add things to it. But for the time being, it's just going to be miniature painting. I'm hoping to pick up a proper camera before too many videos go out. This phone that I have is really hard to pick up some of the fine detail. If you're interested in learning more about High Tide Games, you can check us out on Facebook at High Tide Games BC over here. If you want to take a look at some of the other painting projects I'm working on, or get sneak peeks at some of the next videos that are coming out, you can find me on Instagram under the handle An Idle Fellow here. Yeah, that's kind of it. Until then, we'll see you next time. Bye. Visiting British Columbia? Stop by High Tide Games and say hello. We're only 4 hours and 2 ferry rides north of Vancouver. Oh, my wife's gonna have a fun time editing this. Why did you videotape what you were drilling? Why did you videotape your drilling? Well, I don't know. Because who knows when something goes wrong, terribly, terribly wrong, and you want a record of it. A few moments later. Oh! I went too deep. I went too deep. He's got a hole in his foot now. That's okay. That's okay. We will fill that up with something. Oh, Birdman!